Who is it that tells him the hard truths? Is that you?
I do, and almost everyone he surrounds him with does. That doesn't mean, and again, I think we're in a very unique time where noise equals, in a lot of people's perception, advocacy, and I fundamentally disagree with that.
Joining us now, former Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, Andy Card. And here on set, author Chris Whipple. His new book is The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Joe, we were just talking here before we came back on air, and I think the question is, does the president want an adult in the room, especially as it pertains to his chief of staff? What do you think? He certainly does.
He certainly doesn't want anybody that will tell him the hard truth. I'm sure his daughter gives him the hard truth, but I know for a fact that few others around him do. And Andy Card, he doesn't want to hear the hard truth. And if you have somebody that's running the White House that, you know, and how do I know? Because one time in the middle of one of these crises early on, I said, Donald, who do you talk to?
Right.
When you were in the middle of the crisis, who is the person that comes in and talks to you and says no? And the answer was nobody. He said, I'm that guy. Well, we're now at 34%. Maybe you can't build a skyscraper by yourself, and maybe you can't run the damn White House by yourself.
Andy?
Well, first of all, it's important for the people around the president to find the courage to speak truth to power, even if the president doesn't want to hear it or doesn't welcome it. So I think it's important for them to speak truth to power. And I think President Trump is coming to recognize that that's very important, especially with this international crisis where there is one on virtually every continent right now. There's something going on that is a challenge to the president. So he's got to listen to H.R. McMaster. He's got to pay attention to Jim Mattis when it comes to these challenges. He's got to have a better relationship with his Secretary of State. He's got to invite people to speak truth to him so that he can better understand the consequences of his decisions rather than just the policy of his decisions. Policies are actually easy to dream up. It's the consequence of the policy that's most important to understand so that you modify it when you implement it.
So, Chris, as you looked at the history of the Chief of Staff in the White House, how different is this Chief of Staff? So far, obviously, it's early on, but how different is the role Reince Priebus has played versus Andy Card or Dennis McDonough or Leon Panetta or Jim Baker?
Well, what I learned from talking to all 17 living White House chiefs before Priebus is that every president has learned, sometimes the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House Chief of Staff to execute your agenda and listen to him or her when they tell you what you don't want to hear. There's no indication that Trump wants a person like that in the Oval Office. There's no indication that he wants to listen to hard truths, and he obviously prefers his own facts. As we all know. And that way lies disaster. I mean, these guys are the difference, often the difference between success and disaster in every presidency. And we can just go back to Barack Obama's red line in Syria.
Right.
He took a walk, famously took that walk with Dennis McDonough. They walked for an hour, came back to the Oval Office, and Obama made that shocking to some people decision not to enforce the red line. He's often the only other person in the room when history is made.
So, Andy Card, would you agree with that, especially in that way lies disaster? Chris's point here. And then again, the soundbite that we bumped in with all due respect to Ivanka, who is trying her best on levels that she has expertise in, business and women, she's not qualified to talk to the president about Syria and about North Korea and about the Chinese leader's visit and the consequences of how that conversation goes. Is she? And who is? Who in this administration stands up to the president and says things that actually have consequences, that might even have them fired if need be? Who has the guts?
Well, so far, I don't think I can identify anybody that I would put in that category. You have to have the courage not to seek the pleasure of the president, even though you serve at the president's pleasure. Right. You've got to tell the president what you think he needs to know to be able to make the tough decisions. And yes, there's all kinds of decisions that a president makes, but if a president is making an easy decision, they're wasting their time. The decision should be tough, but the ones around national security and protecting the United States of America and its people, those are the toughest ones to make. So it's really important that the president have a chief of staff, I believe, who can walk in, shut the door, and say, if you can't listen to me, this is another person you should be listening to. Invite this person in to come talk to you, and invite him to speak candidly or her to speak candidly with you. So the chief of staff is really one that makes sure that the president is not making an easy decision, because he shouldn't think they're easy. They are tough decisions, and the president needs to have a chief of staff that actually gets him ready to make a tough decision, and he can be mad at the chief of staff. That's okay. The chief of staff has to accept that, and they have to know they serve at the pleasure of the president for the time being, but they do not do the job to seek the president's pleasure.
So go ahead, Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Andy, you first, and then Chris. In what ways is Reince Priebus the ideal White House chief of staff?
Ooh.
Well, first of all, Reince Priebus he's a very solid, grounded person. He did an outstanding job leading the Republican National Committee and the Republican Party. He knows Washington. He's not necessarily a complete insider. He's someone who came from the outside to help people understand what was going on inside, and the insiders to recognize what's going on outside. So I think he's got the right skills. I'm just not sure he's been empowered by the president to keep the discipline that is necessary for the president to do his job. And the discipline is about access to the president, it's taking space in the president's head, and it's taking time that the president can't afford to give. The chief of staff job is to manage that presidential head space and measure the time that the president needs to take to make these tough decisions that have to be made. You don't want a president who is making an impulsive decision. You want him to make an informed decision, especially where there are significant consequences to whatever the decision might be.
Chris, how is Reince Priebus like the most successful recent White House chiefs of staff?
Well, Andy's a diplomat. The truth is that if you oppose everything Donald Trump stands for, then this is the White House staff for you. It's been rookie mistake after rookie mistake. No competent White House chief would permit an executive order on immigration to go out into the world without vetting it with the departments in charge. It's been mistake after mistake after mistake. Priebus is clearly no Jim Baker or Leon Panetta. What you really need, and Trump of all people needs more than perhaps any other predecessor, is a grown-up in the room who understands Capitol Hill, who understands what Jim Baker used to call the centrifuge where policy and politics come together. You have to be able to execute the president's agenda and tell him what he doesn't want to hear.
You know, Chris, it's interesting you were talking about Barack Obama making the decision that he made on Syria on the red line. And it's so interesting, you had official Washington quietly grumbling for 8 years that Barack Obama always thought he was the smartest guy in the room, that when it came to foreign policy, he didn't talk to his Secretary of State the way he should. He didn't talk to his National Security Advisor the way he should, that he whittled it down, and it was Barack Obama, Ben Rhodes, and sometimes, as you just said, Dennis McDonough. So, interestingly enough, the last president blew apart the White House analytical construct that we've used for a very long time. Is it the case that we've just gone from bad in that situation to worse?
Well, excuse me. I think that you know, Obama decided after the low point of his presidency in 2011 that he had no choice in his mind but to govern through executive orders. You know, McDonough was extremely effective at doing that, I think, for better or worse. With the help of John Podesta, I think they were able to you know, the Iran deal, the opening to Cuba, on a number of fronts, they were able to make what they regarded as progress.
Right, but Chris, I'm talking about foreign policy, though. I'm talking about using Ben Rhodes instead of John Kerry. Sometimes talking to Dennis McDonough instead of talking to your National Security Advisor, Susan Rice. Was that not the way he ran his foreign policy? You know,
that's the way foreign policy has been run since the days of Nixon and H.R. Haldeman. I mean, the fact is that power resides in the White House and has as you know, since those days. And as Erskine Bowles put it to me, he said, you know, the cabal, that little cabal in the West Wing that controls the information that goes to the president, information is power. And it's been true for decades now that that's where the decisions are made on the key questions in foreign policy.
All right, Andy Card, thank you very much, and Chris Whipple, thank you as well. The new book is The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.